Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new wrestling drama starring Zac Efron, The Iron Claw. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So professional wrestling is often derided as this being fake, but according to wrestler Kevin Von Erich, who is played by Zac Efron in this movie, there's nothing fake about what happens in the wrestling ring. And while that assertion obviously can be debated, the many hardships that did plague the real-life Von Erich family were certainly real. The Iron Claw is based on true events, and it's definitely a film that has aspirations to at least be in the conversation when it comes time for sort of the awards conversation at the end of the year. Personally, I don't think that this movie is going to reach those lofty heights. I'm somewhat mixed on this movie, but I do think it is a very well-crafted and I think well-acted drama. I think it has a strong cast, and The Iron Claw is sort of this a raw and somber drama that explores kind of weighty themes of just grief and faith and sort of the emptiness of worldly pursuits. And audiences will probably need to set their expectations for this film accordingly, because The Iron Claw is not a sports movie in like a traditional sense. Kind of unlike a movie like Rocky or Creed, where viewers sort of they cheer on the underdog to victory in a bunch of like high adrenaline matches. Like I said, Iron Claw is more of like a raw and kind of melancholic drama that just sort of has wrestling as the backdrop of this, because the wrestling scenes themselves are quite short and surprisingly infrequent, as the film focuses less sort of on like the family's victories in the ring and more on kind of the more like the hardship and the tragedies that the family experiences outside of it. And there are certainly enough hardships and tragedies to fill this 2-hour runtime. Spoken of in this movie as the Von Erich family curse, the film traces this very close-knit, or at least the brothers' kind of close-knit family that is sort of ultimately sort of comes unraveled due to a series of just like untimely deaths and suicide and drug use and just sort of escalating misery. In fact, the tragedies, like the real life tragedies that plagued this family are so plentiful that like, the film itself actually cuts out one of the brothers from the story. Chris, the younger brother of the family who died from suicide, isn't featured in this film because the director didn't want the film to feel too repetitive with all the sort of the suicides and the tragedies. So kind of as might be expected from that source material, The Iron Claw is a very heavy film, a film that is sort of shooting more for awards recognition rather than just providing kind of mere entertainment value. The real life Kevin Von Erich, who's the character played by Zac Efron, actually is a professing Christian, and I think like a faith-based version of this story likely would have like softened the tragedies and the hardships in order to elevate a more inspirational story about the power of faith. But The Iron Claw is produced by A24, which is a studio that's has a well-earned reputation for more serious and kind of gritty dramas. And kind of as a result, in this movie, the family they take a pummeling throughout this film, really with only this occasional hints of like hopefulness and light to pierce, and it's almost like suffocating darkness, which isn't to say that like faith doesn't still play a role, just that it's mostly left sort of in the background of this. I might say that I think The Iron Claw is not a film that's about faith as much as it is like our need for faith and just the destructive futility of more like temporal pursuits. Actor Zac Efron, he has come a long way since his days as like a teenage heartthrob and singing songs in High School Musical. He obviously does have a very physical presence. Guy spent a lot of hours in the gym to prepare for this role, but I think he also has kind of more quality like acting chops than he might be given credit for if people are just judging him on like his early films. And I think despite the fact that Kevin, the character, is very soft-spoken, he's not a man of a lot of words, Zac Efron is able to sort of subtly communicate and like emote just sort of that inner turmoil that is raging sort of just beneath the surface. In fact, I think the entire cast of this movie is excellent. Sort of that loving dynamic between the Von Erich brothers is like the beating heart of this film. And I also appreciated like the romantic relationship between Kevin and sort of his romantic interest, Pam, who is played by actress Lily James, that dynamic did feel very nuanced and just authentic. At times, this movie can feel a little bit repetitive, as it just sort of seems to sometimes just jump from one unhappy moment to the next. Although I do think that probably is an intentional decision with the pacing to sort of unfold this continuous, sort of unrelenting, this sort of torrent of misery and tragic events, which does sort of wear you down as the audience, but I think effectively kind of helps you to sort of understand and sympathize with these characters. And like I said, sports movies are kind of known as like a very crowd-pleasing genre, but The Iron Claw isn't a movie that necessarily aims primarily to entertain. Is it compelling? Yes, this is a movie that it keeps your interest despite being a pretty dark and heavy film. Although I don't know if it's a movie that I'd necessarily want to like revisit very often. And I think kind of similar to a movie like Martin Scorsese's Killer of the Flower Moon earlier this year, I think there is value in stories that do sort of shake and jar us and kind of make us uncomfortable rather than just trying to comfort us with sort of spectacle and feel-good moments. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there is some stuff as a Christian to be aware of. As far as language, there is fairly heavy profanity all throughout this movie. By my count, there's about 11 F words, as well as maybe 15 other sort of more minor profanities. And kind of in addition to that, there also is about 5 to 6 kind of religious exclamations of characters kind of using the name of God or Jesus in vain. As far as violence, there's not necessarily much violence like depicted like on screen, although just sort of thematically and there is a lot of death and hardship in this film. There is some kind of bloody violence just in like the wrestling ring where characters get their face sort of bloodied or their head, but nothing much as far as that goes. There's a scene where characters like coughing out, he's coughing like into a toilet, coughing blood, which is implied to be both from like just physical exhaustion and then also like drug use. Like I said, the story involves suicides. There's several suicides in this movie. One of a character that overdoses on pills, and there's another one that dies from gunshot wound. Although you hear the gunshot, you don't necessarily see that moment on screen. Another character is involved in like a motorcycle accident, and while you don't see the actual accident occur, you do see later that character shown with like an amputated leg. As far as sexuality goes, there's some stuff here as well. Most immediately is that the Von Erich brothers do spend a lot of this movie wearing only like either small underwear or else like wrestlers' spandex briefs. A college-age boy is shown or implied to be masturbating in the shower. He's only shown from the chest up, but the implied activity is very clear. And there also is sort of one sex scene in this film that happens like in the front of a car. Both the characters remain clothed throughout the scene and are really only visible through like kind of silhouette. But there is sort of kissing and grinding and like breathy panting, so there's that as well. Kind of the only other thing that comes to mind is sort of in like a pre-match, like a hype-up promo, there is a wrestler that sort of exaggeratingly declares that sort of outside the building, he has a limo with, about 25 women waiting for him, and he very much implies that they're waiting for kind of sexual activities. And the last kind of content thing is, as I've mentioned already, is that there is frequent like drug use and alcohol use as characters are like taking pills and snorting kind of cocaine. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, I do think there's some really interesting stuff that this film is grappling with. And there's a voiceover from Kevin's character right at the beginning of this film that does sort of establish the main like thematic tension, where he says, "Ever since I was a child, people said my family was cursed. Mom tried to protect us with God. Pop tried to protect us with wrestling. He said if we were the toughest, the strongest, nothing could ever hurt us. I believed him. We all did." And sort of those two parents are very much established at the start of this film as representative of like two diverging paths for how these brothers can choose to sort of deal with the hardships and the pain in the world. And kind of as like in that scene, as the mother is shown like bowing her head and starting to pray, the father is more exhorting like the importance of relying on, as he says, relying on no one other than ourselves. And as that opening voiceover kind of establishes, it is sort of the father's like survival of the fittest mentality that ultimately does sort of win out for these brothers, ultimately to like the detriment of the family. Because the Iron Claw, like in the title of this movie, kind of immediately refers to like the famous wrestling hold that was created by this family. But I think in like a more metaphorical sense, it also is reflective of sort of the suffocating grip of their very dominating and like controlling father on these brothers, because the characters all kind of speak about the family curse as being some sort of like influence of like an ambiguous kind of vindictive external force. But as the film progresses, it becomes kind of more and more apparent that the hardships that do befall kind of on this family are of like more human origin as a result of like selfish choices and like the influence of their father. And the film definitely does not hold back on just exposing the emptiness, like the futility of their father's approach of just sort of relying on their own strength. Because there is one very stark kind of visual where one of these brothers is sitting in the kitchen. It's dark. They got a beer in their hand, and they got like, the championship belt that they've just won laying on the table. Sort of everything that the family has been working towards has finally been obtained. And although the brother says, tells his other brothers that he's awake because he just can't come down from the heights, the excitement of the experience, the way the scene is framed very much makes it clear just how unsatisfying, like what a letdown sort of that moment truly is for him. Kind of despite their very imposing physical presences, the brothers are unable to cope kind of in, throughout the world and the hardships on their own strength. In Ecclesiastes 1:2, the Bible says, all is vanity. And that is very much the experience of the Von Erich family, that kind of beneath the flashy surface of sort of all the best the world has to offer, they just can't find any healing or lasting satisfaction. Like I said earlier, there is moments that does point towards kind of hopefulness, that does sort of reflect more the mother's approach to relying on God rather than just your own strength. There is sort of a visual of like a crucifix that's hanging on the wall of the house that's shown at the beginning of this film, and then that same visual returns sort of at the end of the film. And sort of by bookending those two shots, it does in a way kind of represent Kevin's own journey, that having tried it sort of his father's way to do things all on his own strength, that he is sort of returning back to sort of that religious core of his childhood. And there's another scene that I don't want to spoil in this review, but that does sort of give a glimpse of like more of like a peaceful, heavenly sort of reality, sort of life after death. And it's not necessarily clear if that's supposed to be taken literally or if that's just sort of a reflection of Kevin's own kind of processing of the situation. But it does work as an effective way to, in a very dark, kind of gritty, somber film, to at least remind audiences that there is sort of a hope at the end. And there will be, as the Bible, in Revelation makes clear, there will be a time when suffering in the world ends, and there is no more tears or pain or sorrow. So in the end, this is an interesting movie. It's not necessarily the kind of movie that I'm always drawn to. And I do think some of like the more heavy R-rated contents, and even just the fact that the faith element is somewhat left sort of on the fringe implied in the story rather than being explored kind of more up front, I think we'll probably keep some Christian audiences just away from this movie. I don't think this is like a must-see movie. I'm not sure whether or not it will get sort of the award recognition or be a part of that conversation. But I do think that it does, for audiences that can sort of have the endurance to just experience this suffering of this family. I do think it ultimately does offer a very clear message just about the futility of sort of living life on our own strength, and at least implies our desperate need for God. But hey, let me know what you think. If you check out this movie, if you enjoyed it, if you found it just too heavy, or like me, if you do think that it is at least implying some very important messages that Christians can affirm, would love to hear your thoughts. So jump in the comment section. And if you haven't done so, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. We got movie reviews and podcasts and other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.